She burned the ultrasound photo on a Tuesday morning, standing barefoot on cold kitchen tile, watching the edges curl black while the man she loved announced his engagement to someone else on every television in America. 8 weeks pregnant. 8 weeks of believing she was his. 8 weeks of thinking that maybe, just maybe, a woman like her could exist inside a world like his without being swallowed whole. The photo turned to ash in the sink. She kept one scorched corner, just one. Then she packed nothing, took nothing he had ever given her, and walked out the door into a life he would never find. She was wrong about that last part. If this story already has you holding your breath, hit that like button right now. Drop your city in the comments below, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The morning it all came apart started the way most catastrophic mornings do. Quietly, without warning, wrapped inside something that felt almost ordinary. Nia Okafor woke at 6:15 to the sound of rain striking the bedroom window of Tae-jun's penthouse. Not her penthouse. His. That distinction had always mattered to her, even if she'd never said it out loud, even if she'd swallowed it down for 4 months alongside everything else she'd learned to keep quiet about. The city spread out below the floor-to-ceiling glass like something painted. All gray water and steel towers, and the faint amber smear of streetlights that hadn't yet surrendered to the morning. Chicago in November looked like a bruise. She had always loved it anyway. She lay still for a long moment, one hand pressed flat against her stomach beneath the sheets. Nothing showed yet. At 8 weeks, her body kept its secret well. She was a woman trained in the art of reading surfaces, of understanding what lay underneath a painting without disturbing the canvas. It was her professional discipline, her instinct, the thing she was genuinely good at in a world that had given her very few places to be genuinely good at anything. Art conservation. The slow, patient work of saving beautiful things from the damaged time inflicted on them. She knew how to look at something broken and understand what it had been before the destruction. She pressed her palm flat and thought, something is growing in here. Something that did not exist 3 months ago exists now because of you and because of him and because of one night in September when it rained exactly like this, and he came home from something she wasn't allowed to know about with blood on his shirt collar, and she didn't ask and he didn't explain, and they fell into each other instead, the way they always did, the way she had started to believe was its own kind of language. She was going to tell him today. She had rehearsed it 12 different ways. She'd thrown away 11 of them. The version she'd settled on was short, honest. She was going to hand him the ultrasound photo. Small, grainy, unremarkable to anyone who didn't understand what they were looking at, and say, this happened. I need to know what you want to do about it. Not romantic, not a demand. Just the truth laid flat between them like a card on a table. And then she would watch his face and know everything she needed to know about who he actually was. She was good at reading surfaces. She got up, pulled on a robe, walked barefoot to the kitchen because she'd stopped being able to tolerate coffee and she needed ginger tea and the particular silence of a morning before Tae-jun's world woke up and started making its endless blood-soaked demands. She filled the kettle. She set it on the burner. She reached for the remote to turn on something low and forgettable in the background, some morning news program, the kind of droning ambient sound that made a penthouse feel less like a beautiful cage. She was not watching the television. She was watching steam rise from the kettle. So the first thing she registered was not a face. It was a name. His name spoken by a news anchor in the careful, enunciated cadence of someone reading from a teleprompter. Prominent Chicago business figure Kang Tae-jun, whose investment portfolio spans real estate, private logistics, and international finance, announced late last night his engagement to Han Seo-yeon, daughter of Han Myung-soo, founder of the Han Group, one of South Korea's most powerful conglomerates. The engagement, described by representatives for both families as, Nia turned around. She looked at the screen. Tae-jun's photograph was on the left side of the frame. A formal portrait she recognized. He'd had it taken 8 months ago for some business publication she wasn't supposed to know he'd been profiled in. Beside it, a photograph of a woman. Han Seo-yeon, dark-haired, composed, dressed in something that probably cost more than Nia made in 3 months of careful, meticulous conservation work. The lower third of the screen read, Kang Tae-jun announces engagement to Han Seo-yeon in joint statement. The kettle started screaming. She didn't move. The anchor continued. The union is expected to strengthen economic ties between Chicago-based Kang Holdings and the Seoul-headquartered Han Group, with sources citing long-standing negotiations between both families dating back several years. A spokesperson confirmed the couple will wed in a private ceremony before the end of... Nia turned off the burner. She stood very still in the kitchen of a man who had never once mentioned that his family had been negotiating his marriage for years while she was in his bed, while she was growing something that was half his inside her body, while she was rehearsing the 12 ways she might tell him today, on this exact Tuesday morning in November while rain struck the glass and Chicago looked like a bruise below them. She reached into the pocket of her robe. The ultrasound photo was still there. She'd carried it for 4 days, waiting for the right moment. The edges were soft from handling. She looked at it for a long time, at that small gray smear of possibility, at the thing that was supposed to change everything, that she had believed would finally give this hidden life of hers some kind of shape or meaning. She walked to the sink. She picked up the lighter she kept in the kitchen drawer for the tapered candles Tae-Jun liked at dinner, and she burned it. She watched it go. The paper caught fast at the corner and the flame moved inward, darkening the image, consuming that small gray ghost until there was nothing left but a curl of black ash and one scorched triangle of corner, no bigger than her thumbnail. She didn't know why she kept that piece. She didn't examine the impulse. She just slid it into her pocket, turned on the faucet, and watched the rest of it wash down the drain. Then she went to the bedroom and packed. Not much. She was deliberate about it. She took nothing he had bought her, none of the clothes he'd chosen, none of the jewelry she'd worn exactly twice because it felt like costuming for a role she hadn't agreed to play, none of the small, beautiful objects that had accumulated over 4 months in his space. She took her work bag, her personal documents, the emergency cash she'd kept folded at the back of a notebook because she'd grown up in a household where her mother told her, "Always keep something that is only yours." She took her phone, then stopped, then left it on the counter because she understood enough about his world to know that a phone was a leash. She wrote nothing down, left no note. The absence of explanation was its own kind of statement. She was in the elevator before she let herself think about him. Actually think about him. Not the man on the television screen beside Han So-yeon's composed and expensive face, but Tae-Jun as she knew him, which was different and more complicated, and the reason this hurt the way it did. Tae-Jun with his sleeves rolled to the elbow at midnight, going over numbers she wasn't supposed to see. Tae-Jun speaking Korean on the phone, with a cadence that dropped lower and harder when something was wrong. Tae-Jun standing in her real apartment, her actual apartment, the one she'd kept even after she started spending every night here, the one with the bad radiator and the conservation supplies stacked by the window, looking at a painting she'd been restoring for 6 weeks, asking questions about it with what seemed like genuine curiosity, which had surprised her because she'd thought by then she had a solid understanding of what interested him and what didn't. He had never lied to her. That was the thing she kept arriving at in the elevator's mirrored walls as the floors dropped. He had never made her a promise he'd broken. He had simply never told her the truth of what she was to him. And she had been so determined not to ask, so careful not to be the woman who demanded definitions, who pushed for clarity, who made things uncomfortable by wanting too much, that she had left the space around them full of comfortable silence and her own convenient assumptions. The lobby was nearly empty. The doorman, whose name was Gerald, and who had never once treated her with anything less than perfect professional courtesy, looked up when she came through. He saw the bag. He saw her face. He did not say anything, which she respected and which also nearly undid her completely. Outside, the rain was cold and immediate and real. She walked 2 blocks before she found a cab. Got in, gave an address, not her own apartment, not anywhere Tae-Jun's people knew about. She had a colleague from her conservator training program, a woman named Bess who lived in Wicker Park, and who would open her door at any hour without asking questions because Nia had done the same for her twice. She'd figure out the rest from there. In the back of the cab, with the city sliding past rain-streaked glass, she pressed her hand flat against her stomach again. She thought, "I'm sorry. That's the only thing I can tell you right now. I'm sorry I brought you into this before I understood what this was." She did not cry. She filed that away for later, for when there was somewhere private to do it. She had always been efficient about grief, but Kang Tae-jun returned to the penthouse at 11:17 that night. He knew before he reached the bedroom. He wasn't certain how he knew. Some shift in the quality of the air, some instinct honed by years of operating inside environments where reading a room wrong could cost a life. He had learned to register absence the way other men registered presence. And the penthouse felt wrong, felt emptied of something specific. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. Her phone was on the counter. That detail hit him differently than anything else could have. Not her clothes missing from the closet. He checked that next, and they were, all of it, gone so surgically that it looked intentional rather than hasty. Not the absence of her work bag, which he'd memorized the location of the way he memorized everything worth memorizing. The phone. Because Nia Okafor was not careless. She was precise and deliberate, and she had left that phone here on purpose, which meant she understood something about his world that he'd never explicitly told her, and that understanding made her departure not impulsive but planned, and planned departures from people who understood his world were the most dangerous kind. He called his head of security. One ring. She's gone. He kept his voice flat. Pull every camera on the building. Find out how she left and when. A pause. Then, sir, I should tell you that Ms. Okafor, the building system logged her exit at 7:04 this morning. On foot, she took a cab 2 blocks east. 7 in the morning. He had been in a meeting at 7 in the morning. He had been sitting across a table from Han Myung-soo's lawyers, finalizing the language of an engagement announcement he had not been given a choice about. That had been 17 years in the making before he'd ever met Nia. That was a blood compact dressed up in business language. An alliance his father had negotiated before Tae-jun was old enough to understand what being Korean Mafia royalty meant for the architecture of his private life. He sat down on the kitchen stool. The counter was clean. She'd cleaned up before she left, which was such a specific detail, so exactly her, that it got through the composure he'd spent 20 years reinforcing. Find her, he said. All resources. Discreet. I want to know where she is within 24 hours. Another pause. Longer this time. His security chief, Jin Ho, had worked for him for 8 years and was one of approximately 4 people alive permitted to push back on a direct order. Sir, given the announcement this morning, are you certain this is the direction you want to take? Tae-jun looked at the clean counter. Did I ask for an assessment? No. Find her. He did not find her in 24 hours. He did not find her in 48. By the end of the first week, he had surveillance teams covering every neighborhood in Chicago where she had any connection. Her actual apartment, which was empty and already paid up through the end of the year, clearly vacated before this morning. The restoration studio where she worked 3 days a week, where her supervisor told Jin Ho's people with visible discomfort that Nia had called in a personal emergency and that her position would be held for 2 weeks before they'd have to make decisions. Bess Alvarez's apartment in Wicker Park, which went cold after 48 hours because Nia had moved on. She had moved on deliberately and efficiently, the way she did everything. He had not fully understood until now how thoroughly he had underestimated her. He'd known she was intelligent. He'd known she was careful. He had not understood that she'd been quietly constructing an exit while he was constructing plans that had no room in them for the question of what she might need. The engagement announcement ran in every major paper. His publicist managed the coverage, keeping it framed as a corporate alliance, which it was, which was also the least of what it was. Han Seo-yeon sent a formal note through her family's lawyers, gracious, impersonal, nothing that acknowledged the reality of what they were agreeing to or what it would cost either of them. He had met her 3 times over the course of the negotiation. She was composed and ambitious, and they had looked at each other across a dinner table with the mutual recognition of 2 people who understood exactly what this was and had each made a separate private peace with it. He had made his peace based on the assumption that his private life was his private life. He had not accounted for Nia. This was the error he turned over in the first weeks, alone in the penthouse, that felt wrong now in ways he could not entirely articulate. He had not accounted for her. Not for what she was to him specifically, not for what 4 months of her particular kind of presence had done to the internal architecture of a man who had long since accepted that certain things were not available to him. Not love specifically, not the uncomplicated, ungoverned kind. His life had too many edges, too many people in it whose loyalty was contractual, too many rooms he entered knowing everyone in them was calculating something, Nia had never calculated anything around him. She'd argued with him about a painting once for 45 minutes. Some debate about the ethics of over-restoration, about the line between preservation and erasure. With the complete and obvious conviction that her opinion mattered independently of who he was or what he controlled, and it had so disarmed him that he'd had to leave the room to collect himself. He had never told her what that argument meant to him. He had never told her much of anything that mattered. He understood this now. He understood it with the cold, precise clarity that he typically reserved for identifying strategic errors in a business context. And he found it almost interesting how the same machinery of analysis that made him effective in one domain could turn on the private life with equal precision and reveal exactly where you had failed. He had failed her. The specific shape of the failure was this. He had let her exist in a space beside his life rather than inside it, because inside it was complicated and required decisions he wasn't ready to make. And he had been selfish enough to want her there in that adjacent space indefinitely, available to him, permanent in her own quiet way, without having to resolve anything, without having to choose. She had resolved it for him. He found himself respecting her for it, which made the searching harder and more urgent at the same time. The weeks built into a month. The month stretched toward 2. The engagement moved forward with the momentum of an arranged institutional process. Meetings with lawyers, sessions with event planners, the mechanical forward roll of something that had been set in motion years before he'd had any say in its direction. Han Seo-yeon appeared in his office once, formally, to discuss timeline. She looked at him with those dark, composed eyes and said, "I assume you've resolved your personal complications?" He looked back at her. "There are no complications." "Good." She stood. "I have my own interests in this arrangement, Tae-jun. I won't pretend otherwise, but I need the foundation to be clean." "It's clean." He watched her leave and felt nothing in particular, which seemed like its own kind of answer about what this marriage was and wasn't going to be. The surveillance teams continued their work in parallel. Jin-ho gave him weekly updates, each one a variation on the same story. No credit card activity under her real name, no contact with anyone from her previous life, no digital footprint, nothing. She had become a ghost, which required resources and intelligence and the willingness to be genuinely uncomfortable, and he thought about that every time Jin-ho delivered another empty report. She was out there somewhere, uncomfortable and determined and pregnant. He didn't know that yet, wouldn't know it for months. Building a life from scratch because she had decided that disappearing was preferable to being the hidden woman behind his political marriage. She had burned something before she left. He found the ash in the sink drain 3 weeks later, after the housekeeper mentioned it. Paper ash. He didn't know what it had been. He would find out. He would find out everything, eventually, because Kang Tae-jun did not accept losses. Not in business, not in the specific region of his internal world that he didn't have clean language for. The region that Nia Okafor had quietly colonized over 4 months without either of them entirely acknowledging it was happening. He would find her. What he would do when he did. What he could offer her, given that he was 3 months from marrying another woman in a ceremony that would be witnessed by every significant criminal organization on the eastern seaboard. That was the problem he couldn't yet solve. Autumn. 5 months after she disappeared, a routine medical emergency in a small town outside Rockford, Illinois, produced a name. Not a full name, not even a last name. A first name caught on a background audio recording from a paramedic's body camera, spoken by a bystander who had apparently intervened quickly and with enough medical composure to draw notice. A woman helping at the scene of a collapse in what the initial report described as a local bakery. The paramedic had addressed her formally. She'd corrected him without thinking, given her real name, just her first name, not the one on her new identification. Just Nia, spoken on instinct before she caught herself, and gone back to helping. The paramedic's report flagged the bystander as cooperative and medically knowledgeable. The body camera footage was routine municipal documentation. Jin-ho's people had been running algorithmic searches across municipal databases for 5 months. Every emergency report, every background name, every data point that might carry a fragment of her. It was the kind of search that produced hundreds of false leads, and took the patience of someone who understood that thoroughness was the only strategy that worked when someone intelligent was hiding. The name hit the system at 3:40 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. Jin-ho called Tae-jun directly. Taejun was in a meeting with 4 lawyers and Han Myung-soo's senior representative when the call came through. He looked at the screen. He said, "I need 5 minutes," and walked out of the room without waiting for a response, which the lawyers noted and which Han Myung-soo's representative noted and which nobody commented on because Kang Taejun walked out of rooms when he chose to. "Tell me," he said in the hallway. Jin-ho told him, "A small town, a bakery, a woman working under a name that was not her name, hiding her past, living small and quiet and deliberate in the way she did everything. A first name spoken on reflex to a paramedic at a scene where she'd done what Nia Okafor always did when she saw something beautiful or fragile or in trouble. She'd move toward it instead of away. That detail also got through the composure. He stood in the hallway outside the meeting room with the city spread beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass and thought about a woman standing in a bakery in a small town outside Rockford, 5 months pregnant, and working under a false name and still unable to walk past someone who needed help without stopping. "I'm going myself," he said. "Sir, I strongly advise—" "I know what you advise." He was already moving. "Have the car ready in 10 minutes, and Jin-ho, nobody else. No team, just us." A long pause. "She won't respond well to a show of force." "I know. She's been hiding from exactly that." "I know," he said again, and there was something in his voice that Jin-ho had not heard before and did not have clean language for and chose not to comment on. "That's why it's just us." He went back into the meeting room. He looked at the 4 lawyers and the senior representative, and he said, with the particular precision he used when he needed something to be very clearly understood, "We're done for today." Then he walked out of the building, got into the car, and drove north toward a woman who had decided, correctly, based on available information, that he was not worth staying for. He was going to give her reasons to reconsider that assessment. He wasn't yet certain whether he had any. The car moved through Chicago traffic and then out onto the highway, into flat gray November farmland, and the distance closed between him and the thing he'd lost through inattention and selfishness, and the specific failure of men who believe that wanting someone is the same as choosing them. The bakery would close at 6. It was 4:45. He pressed his palm flat against the cold window glass and watched the miles go, and thought about what a man like him could possibly say to a woman like her that would mean anything at all, and found, to his considerable discomfort, that he did not yet know. Nia was pulling a tray from the oven when the bell above the bakery door rang at 5:53. She heard it the way she heard everything now, cataloged it, assigned it its appropriate level of threat, moved on. The bell meant a customer. The bakery closed at 6, and they almost never got walk-ins this late. But occasionally someone came in for bread or one of the cardamom rolls that her boss, Marlene, made every morning at 4. Nia kept her back to the door, set the tray on the rack, stripped off her oven mitts. The bell. A customer. She turned around. Kang Tae-jun was standing in the doorway of a small-town Illinois bakery wearing a dark coat that cost more than everything in the display case combined, and the look on his face was the specific kind of controlled devastation that she had learned over 4 months of watching him closely meant that something had broken through whatever he kept himself behind. Her body registered him before her mind finished processing the information. A single full system response. Adrenaline, recognition, something that was not and had never been simple to name. Her hand moved without her permission to the front of her apron, pressing flat against the swell of her stomach that was impossible to miss now, at 33 weeks, enormous and obvious, and the one thing she had known from the moment she walked out of his penthouse, that she could not let him see. He saw it. His eyes dropped to her stomach. Whatever he'd come in here intending to say, whatever he'd spent a 5-month search and a 2-hour drive preparing himself to say, it left him completely. She watched it happen. She watched his face do something she had never seen it do in 4 months of watching. It came apart. Not loudly. He wasn't a man who came apart loudly, but the careful architecture of composure he lived inside developed a visible fracture, right there in the doorway, between one breath and the next. Neither of them spoke. The tray was still warm behind her. She could smell cardamom. She could hear Marlene moving in the back, the sound of a mixer winding down. And Nia Okafor, who had spent 5 months building something solid and small and survivable out of the ruins of what she'd burned in his kitchen sink, pressed her hand flat against the child they had made together without intending to, and looked at the man she had run from. The man she would not let herself love again. The man who had chosen a political marriage over the truth of what they were. The man whose name was in the papers beside another woman's name, and said, in a voice that did not shake, because she had spent 5 months making sure nothing about her shook anymore, "You need to leave." He stepped inside. The bell above the door rang again as it swung shut behind him. And the small, warm bakery in the small, quiet town suddenly held everything that had been building between them for the better part of a year, and there was nowhere left to run. He did not leave. That was the first thing. He stepped inside, and the bell rang behind him, and he did not leave. And Nia stood in the warm cardamom air of Marlene's bakery, with her hand pressed flat against 33 weeks of secret, and looked at him the way she had trained herself not to look at anything anymore. Directly, without flinching, without giving anything away. "I said leave, Taejun." "I heard you." "Then you understand what the word means." He was looking at her stomach, not staring. He wasn't a man who stared. It wasn't in his repertoire of behaviors. He was too controlled for that. But his eyes kept returning to it the way a tongue returns to a split lip. Involuntary. Compelled by something that bypassed whatever machinery he used to govern himself. "How long?" he said. "That's not your question to ask." "Nia, don't." She pulled the apron strings loose at her back, kept her hands moving because her hands needed something to do. "Don't say my name like that. Don't come in here like this is something you have the right to walk into." "I'm not here about rights." "Then what are you here about?" "Because the last time I checked, you were engaged." She folded the apron, set it on the counter. Her movements were controlled and deliberate, and cost her more than she wanted to admit because her chest was doing something terrible, and she needed it to stop. The announcement ran in 6 papers. "Congratulations." She looks very composed. Something moved across his face, gone before she could classify it. "The engagement is a political arrangement. I've told you about the world You never told me anything." The words came out harder than she'd planned, with more force behind them, and she felt the baby shift in response to the spike in her body's tension, a slow rolling movement against her ribs that she had to actively not react to. "That was the arrangement, wasn't it? I didn't ask, you didn't explain, we just existed. In this comfortable little space where I got to pretend I knew who you were, and you got to pretend I was enough." "You were—" "Don't finish that sentence." He closed his mouth. From the back, Marlene's mixer wound down to silence. In 30 seconds, she was going to come through that door to start the closing routine, and Nia did not have 30 seconds to resolve what was happening in this room. "You need to go," she said, quieter now. "I have a job. I have a life here. You don't get to show up, and you're carrying my child." The directness of it landed like a fist. She hadn't expected him to say it that plainly, that fast, without preamble or maneuvering. Taejun operated in angles. He came at things sideways. The bluntness was new, and it destabilized her for exactly 3 seconds, which was 3 seconds too long. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. "Don't insult either of us," he said quietly. The back door swung open and Marlene came through. 62 years old, wide-shouldered, with the permanently flour-dusted forearms of someone who had been baking bread since before Nia was born. She stopped when she saw Taejun, took him in with the quick, unimpressed assessment of a woman who had lived in a small town long enough to recognize when something from a bigger, more dangerous world had walked through her door. "We're closing," Marlene said. "I know." Taejun's voice shifted. Not warmer exactly, but calibrated to be less alarming, and that small demonstration of control made something in Nia's throat tighten. "I just need a few minutes with your colleague. I apologize for the timing." Marlene looked at Nia. Nia looked back at her boss and thought about the 3 months she'd spent here, the 4:30 mornings, the way Marlene had never once asked her last name or where she'd come from, or why a woman with her evident education was pulling trays and packaging loaves in a bakery 2 hours from Chicago. Marlene had just handed her an apron and shown her the oven schedules, and that uncomplicated acceptance had been one of the small things that had kept Nia functional when functional was genuinely in question. "5 minutes, Nia said. "I'll lock up." Marlene looked at Taejun for another moment. Then she untied her own apron, set it on the hook by the door, collected her coat and keys, and walked out the front without another word. The bell rang. The door swung shut. Silence. Nia turned to face him fully. He was looking at her stomach again. And then something happened that she was completely unprepared for. He crossed the small space between them. Not fast, not aggressive. He moved carefully, the way someone moves toward something fragile. And he reached out and pressed his palm flat against the curve of her belly. And the baby, who had been still for the last hour, chose that precise moment to kick, hard, twice. She felt him go still under her skin, felt his breath catch. She watched his face, and what she saw there was not the controlled calculation she associated with him, was not the careful composure he wore like structural reinforcement. It was something rawer than that, something that looked almost like a man being taken apart from the inside quietly by the specific pressure of a child's foot against his open hand. She stepped back. "Don't," she said, and her voice was not steady anymore. "Naya, I mean it." She moved behind the counter, put the physical barrier between them. "Whatever that was, whatever you felt just now, it doesn't change anything. You're engaged. Your people have been negotiating this for years. You have an empire and an alliance and a whole architecture of obligation that has nothing to do with me, and I made my peace with that. I left clean. I didn't ask you for anything. All I'm asking now is that you leave me alone." He was still looking at his own hand, like he was trying to understand what had just happened to it. "I'm not leaving you alone," he said. "You don't have a choice. I have every resource I have used for 5 months to find you." He looked up. "You think I'm going to walk out of this bakery and leave you here?" "Yes, because the alternative is that you take something from me that isn't yours to take, and you know enough about who you are and what your world does to people to understand why I ran. I know why you ran. Then respect it." "I can't." The words came out with a difficulty that surprised her, like they cost him something to produce. Taejun did not struggle with language. He was precise and deliberate and always had the right architecture of words available. This was different. This was a man working without his usual tools. "I have spent 5 months understanding exactly why you left, and I will not accept it as permanent. It's not your decision. You're carrying my child. That makes it—" "Don't." The word came out like a crack. "Don't tell me what that makes it. Don't stand there and use my pregnancy to claim something you gave up the right to when you let your family sell you to another woman without telling me it was happening." The air in the bakery was very still. She watched him take that, watched him absorb it without deflecting, without the sophisticated maneuvering she'd expected. He just stood there and let it land. "You're right," he said. She blinked. She had not expected that. "I should have told you. I should have been honest about what the engagement was and when it was happening and what it meant for us. I chose not to because He stopped, rebuilt. "Because I didn't want to have the conversation. Because having the conversation required decisions I wasn't ready to make. That was selfish, and it cost you everything you'd built here, and I understand that." The acknowledgement sat between them like something physical. She didn't trust it. She wanted to. She recognized that want the way you recognize something dangerous, but she had spent 5 months building a version of herself that did not require his honesty, and she was not going to dismantle that on the basis of one accurate sentence. "Thank you for saying that," she said carefully. "Now leave. Come back to Chicago." "Absolutely not. You're 8 weeks from your due date. You're working in a bakery. You're living under a false name in a town where nobody knows you, with no medical history established, no plan for—" "I have a plan." "Tell me the plan, Naya." "It's not your plan to know. It involves my child. It involves my child that I'm choosing to raise in a way that does not include being a kept secret in a man's penthouse while he marries someone else at a Mafia wedding." The last 2 words hung in the air. She had said it out loud. What he was, what the world she'd been adjacent to actually was, and the directness of it changed the texture of the room. He didn't deny it. He never had, not directly. His world operated in the space between acknowledgement and deniability, but he had never looked her in the eye and told her she was wrong about what she was seeing. "The engagement will end," he said. "When?" He was quiet. "Right." She nodded. "After the wedding, after the alliance is secured, after you've gotten what your family needs from the arrangement. And then what? You divorce a mafia heiress and bring home the black art conservator you've had hidden in a small town? How does that go for me? How does that go for our child? I would protect you both. You're not listening to me. She pressed both hands flat on the counter between them, leaned forward, and made sure he was looking directly at her. I don't want protection. I want to not be in a situation that requires it. Those are different things. Do you understand the difference? He understood. She could see that he understood. What she could also see was that understanding it did not change what he intended to do. And that gap, between his comprehension and his actions, was exactly the gap she had fallen into 4 months ago and was not going to fall into again. I'm not coming back with you, she said. I'm going to finish closing this bakery and go home and sleep, and tomorrow I'm going to come back here and do my job. That's what I'm doing. I'll be outside tonight. I'll call the police. You won't. He said it without arrogance, just certainty. And the certainty was the problem because he was right. She wouldn't. Because involving the police meant paperwork and documentation and her real name surfacing in a report, and all of that put her exactly where she didn't want to be. He knew her constraints better than she wanted him to. You can't just... She stopped, breathed. Taejun, listen to me. I am not a problem you can solve by surrounding me with more resources. I am a person who made a decision. You have to respect it. I respect it, he said. I'm also not leaving. He was outside the next morning when she arrived at 4:30 for the early shift. He was sitting in an unremarkable dark car parked across the street, and the only reason she knew it was him was that Jin Ho was behind the wheel, and she recognized the particular stillness of the car, the way it didn't belong to the street, too clean, too still, too watchful. She went inside without looking at it. She pulled trays. She mixed dough. She worked the 4:30 to noon shift with the specific focus she'd developed over 5 months of needing her body to function independently of whatever her mind was doing. Marlene came in at 5 and looked at Nia and looked at the window and said nothing, which continued to be the thing Nia most valued about her. At noon, when her shift ended, she walked out the front and Taejun was leaning against the car, not aggressive, not commanding, just present. Coat open despite the cold, hands in his pockets, looking at her with that expression she still didn't have clean language for. You look tired, he said. I'm 33 weeks pregnant. I'm always tired. Let me take you to lunch. No. Coffee, whatever you're drinking. Taejun, 1 hour, public place. You can leave whenever you want. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold with flowers still on her forearm and 33 weeks of exhaustion in her spine and thought about the 12 reasons she should walk in the opposite direction. She went to lunch with him. Twat. They sat in a diner 2 blocks from the bakery in a corner booth, and the diner was the kind of place where the menus were laminated and the coffee came automatically, and nobody looked twice at anyone. Nia wrapped both hands around a mug of ginger tea that the waitress had produced without comment when Nia declined coffee, and she looked across the table at Kang Tae-jun in a laminated menu diner and thought about how spectacularly wrong this was as a setting for everything they needed to say. The engagement, she said. Walk me through it. Actually, walk me through it. No framing, no management. What is it? He told her. It took 20 minutes. He told her about his father's negotiations with Han Myung-soo, about the territorial agreements, about what the alliance meant for the stability of the organizations on both sides, about Seo-yeon's role in the structure and what both families expected from the marriage. He told it flat, without apology, but also without the distant corporate language he used when he was managing how something sounded. He just told her the truth of it, and she listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. And you were going to do it, she said. I was going to do it. While I was... She stopped. I didn't know. His voice changed on those 3 words. I didn't know about the pregnancy. I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking for credit for it. I know that the engagement was its own betrayal regardless of whether you were pregnant, but I need you to know that if I had known... What? What would you have done differently? He was honest enough not to answer immediately. He looked at his coffee cup, turned it a quarter rotation, looked up. I don't know, he said. I want to say I would have chosen differently. I think I would have. But I've made enough strategic assessments in my life to understand that I'm not reliable on questions about my own motivations. That honesty was more disarming than any certainty would have been. She looked at him across the laminated table and felt something loosen in her chest that she needed to stay tight. "I'm not coming back to Chicago," she said. "Nia, I'll consider a compromise." She said it before she'd fully decided to say it, felt the words coming out, and followed them. "You want to be involved. Fine. We can talk about what involvement looks like that doesn't require me to be inside your world. But I'm not moving back into that penthouse. I am not becoming part of something that also includes a public wedding to another woman. I won't do that to myself, and I won't do it to this child." He leaned forward. "What kind of compromise?" "I don't know yet. I need to think." "Take the time." "You'll still be parked outside the bakery." "Yes." She looked at him. "I genuinely cannot decide if that's protective or terrifying." "It's both," he said, and something moved across his face that in a different life, in a simpler version of things, she might have called almost a smile. She looked away, looked at her tea, pressed her hand to her side where the baby had started moving again, rolling, persistent, restless, in the way that had become familiar over the last few weeks, as though the child inside her had inherited something of both their energies and couldn't decide which one to express. She was going to say something else. She was going to establish a boundary, lay down a parameter, keep the conversation from going somewhere she couldn't control. Her phone rang. The number was one she didn't recognize. A Chicago area code, private, the kind of number that didn't appear in contact lists. She almost didn't answer it. But something, instinct, the conservator's habit of leaning toward rather than away from things that seemed wrong, made her pick up. "Ms. Okafor." The voice on the other end was a woman's. Calm, precise, slightly accented. "My name is Han Seo-yeon. I believe you're sitting across from my fiancé right now. Please don't hang up. What I have to tell you concerns the safety of your child, and I have approximately 3 minutes before my father's people realize I've made this call." Nia went very still. Across the table, Taejun watched her face change and reached for her wrist. Taejun's hand closed around her wrist. At the exact moment, Nia pressed the phone harder against her ear, and she turned her palm upward, not pulling away, just a small rotation, a signal. And he read it and let go, but didn't lean back. He stayed forward, watching her face the way he watched everything that mattered to him, with the total attention of a man who understood that information lived in expressions before it lived in words. "I'm listening," Nia said into the phone. Han Seo-yeon's voice was exactly what she'd expected from the photograph, composed, precise, with an undercurrent of something that might have been urgency if it weren't so rigorously controlled. "My father became aware of your existence approximately 6 weeks ago. One of Taejun's internal staff reported to our organization. The pregnancy was confirmed through medical records obtained from a clinic you visited in Rockford under your assumed name." Nia's stomach dropped. She had been so careful. She had paid cash. She had used the name on her forged documentation. She had chosen a clinic 40 minutes from where she lived specifically to avoid any pattern. "What does your father intend to do?" she said. Not a question. She already understood the shape of what was coming. "He intends to eliminate the complication before the wedding." Seo-yeon's voice didn't change on the word eliminate. It stayed the same careful, even cadence. "You and the child both. He has given a timeline of 10 days. The wedding is in 12. Across the table, Taejun watched Nia's face go to a place he'd never seen it go. Past fear, past anger, into something white and very still, the expression of a person whose threat assessment has just recalibrated at the cellular level. "Why are you telling me this?" Nia said. "Because I have my own reasons for wanting the wedding to fail." A brief pause. "I have forged documents prepared. A new identity, more secure than your current one. Access to accounts totaling approximately 4 million in untraceable assets. A private flight to Zurich departing tomorrow evening. I want you gone from this country before my father's people move. A living woman in Europe with a new name is manageable. A dead woman in Illinois creates complications I cannot control. You want to help me disappear. I want to create a situation in which the wedding cannot proceed, and in which my father cannot use Taejun's illegitimate heir as leverage against either organization. Those interests align with your survival. I'm practical enough to use that alignment." Nia looked at Taejun. His jaw was tight. He knew something was wrong from her face alone. She could see him calculating, running assessments without data, which for a man like him was a particular kind of agony. "I'll need to think about this," Nia said. "You have until 8 this evening." The line clicked. Nia set the phone on the table. The diner sounds came back. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen, a country song from a radio somewhere, the bell above the door as someone left. All of it suddenly very loud against the silence she and Tae-jun were sitting inside. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She watched his face do something she had not seen it do before. It went cold in a specific way, a way that was different from his usual controlled composure, because his usual composure was a choice, and this was something else. This was the temperature dropping out of a man when the part of him that governed threat responses took over from everything else. His hands were flat on the table, very still. "Han Myung-soo," he said. That's what she said. "How long has he known?" 6 weeks, according to her. 6 weeks. She watched him absorb that. The fact that someone inside his organization had sold information about her to a rival, that he had been surveilled without knowing it, that the woman he'd spent 5 months searching for had been found by someone else first, and he hadn't known. "She offered you an exit," he said. "Yes." "Documents, money, a flight tomorrow?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, then, "She has a reason. Seo-yeon doesn't act without a reason. She said she wants the wedding to fail." "Why?" "She didn't explain fully." Nia pressed her fingers flat against the table. "She said a living woman in Europe is manageable. A dead one creates complications." "What complications?" "I don't know. She cut the call." Tae-jun looked at the window. The street outside was ordinary and gray, and a woman walking past was pushing a stroller, and a truck was making a delivery to the hardware store across the street. And none of it had anything to do with the fact that a man in Chicago had decided that Nia and her unborn child needed to be removed from the situation before his daughter's wedding. "You're not taking her offer," Tae-jun said. "That's not your decision. Nia." He looked at her directly. "Whatever Seo-yeon is offering you, she is using you. Whatever she wants from this situation, it isn't your safety. She's positioning pieces. And your alternative is what? I come back to Chicago with you, into the center of the organization that just had someone report my location to your enemies, and that's safer?" He didn't have an immediate answer. She could see him working through it, and the absence of an immediate answer from a man who always had an immediate answer told her everything she needed to know about how compromised the situation was. "There's a leak in my organization," he said. It cost him something to say it. "That gets handled today." "How reassuring." "I'm not asking for reassurance. I'm telling you the operational reality." He leaned forward. "If you take Seo-yeon's offer, you disappear into a situation she controls. Documents she prepared. Accounts she set up. A flight she arranged. Do you understand what that means? You'd be running on her infrastructure. She could pull any piece of it at any time. If I stay, your future father-in-law tries to have me killed in 10 days. He won't get 10 days. You can't promise that. I can promise that I will burn his entire network to the ground before I let him touch you." He said it without heat, without theater, with the flat certainty of a man stating a logistical fact, and that was somehow more alarming and more convincing than any amount of passion would have been. "But I need you somewhere I can actually protect you. Not here. Not in this town where my enemies already know where to find you." Nia looked at him. She was 33 weeks pregnant and exhausted in a way that had become structural, built into her bones, and she was sitting in a diner in Illinois, weighing the relative dangers of 2 different impossible situations. The baby rolled against her ribs. She pressed her hand there, automatic. "Chicago," she said. "Yes." "The penthouse." "Yes." "While you're still publicly engaged to the woman whose father wants me dead." He held her gaze. "Yes." "That is a genuinely terrible plan. It's the only one where I can control the variables." She looked out the window. The woman with the stroller had gone. The street was just a street. Nothing about it looked like a place where the particular weight of this decision was being made. "If I come back," she said slowly, "I am not coming back as what I was before. I'm not a guest in your space. I'm not something you can manage and contain and make decisions around. If I come back, you tell me everything. Every threat, every move you make against Han Myung-soo, every piece of what's happening. I am not kept in a room while men outside it make decisions about my survival." "Agreed." "And the engagement, I'll handle it." "That's not an answer." It's the only answer I have right now, Nia. I need 24 hours. She breathed in, breathed out. The cardamom smell from the bakery was still on her skin, faint and domestic and utterly surreal against everything happening in this booth. 8 hours, she said. I said I'd give Seo-Yan an answer by 8. I'll give you until 7:30 to make whatever calls you need to make. Then I decide. He nodded. He pulled his phone from his pocket and started making calls before they'd even left the table. By the time they reached Chicago at 9 that night, Nia in the back seat of Tae-Jun's car with her single bag and the particular numbness of someone who has made a decision and is not yet certain it was the right one. Jin-ho had already begun the internal audit. Tae-Jun had made 6 calls from the diner and 4 more during the drive. He hadn't told her the content of each call, but she could read the shape of them from his half of the conversations. Short, direct, specific, the cadence of a man issuing orders that would have immediate consequences for whoever received them. The penthouse was exactly as she remembered it. That was its own kind of disorienting, that it had just continued being itself through everything that had happened, unchanged, waiting, all that glass and elevation, and the city spread out below it like a problem being assessed. She stood at the window for a moment, didn't take off her coat. I need a room that's mine, she said. Not yours, not ours, mine. The east bedroom, he said immediately. It has its own bathroom. I'll have whatever you need brought up tonight. I can get my own things. There are people outside this building right now who work for Han Myung-soo. He said it simply. You don't go outside without Jin-ho until this is resolved. She turned from the window. How long? Days, not weeks. You keep saying things like that. This time I mean it differently. Something in his voice. She looked at him properly, at the tiredness around his eyes that she hadn't noticed in the diner's bright light, the particular set of his jaw that she'd learned to read as the face of a man carrying something heavy in silence. I have a meeting tomorrow morning with the commission. I'm bringing evidence of Han Myung-soo's threat against you. If he moves against a woman carrying my heir, it violates every compact the commission operates on. That's leverage I can use. And if the commission sides with him, they won't. But if they do, then I handle it without the commission. He met her eyes. I want you to understand that there is no version of what happens next in which I allow him to harm you. That isn't strategy. That isn't negotiation. That is the one fixed point in everything that's currently in motion. She believed him. She didn't want to. Belief felt like a door she was opening in a structure she'd spent 5 months reinforcing. But she believed him, and the belief sat in her chest heavy and complicated alongside everything else she was carrying. I'm going to sleep, she said. Nia. She stopped. I know this isn't what you wanted. He stood in the middle of his own penthouse looking like a man who understood the difference between what he had and what he deserved. Coming back here. I know what it cost you. You don't know the half of it, she said, but not with cruelty, just accurately. She went to the east bedroom and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in her coat for a long time before she finally took it off. Seo-Yan arrived the next afternoon. Nia was in the kitchen, standing at the counter eating crackers because the nausea that had supposedly ended in the second trimester had made a specific comeback in the last week, when Jin-ho's voice came over the intercom. Sir, Han Seo-Yan is in the lobby, unannounced. She came alone. A pause. Tae-Jun's voice from the other room. Send her up. Nia set down the crackers. She heard Tae-Jun moving toward the entry, heard the elevator, heard the doors open. She stayed in the kitchen. She was not going to perform a disappearing act in a space she'd agreed to occupy. She'd made that decision in the east bedroom last night, somewhere around 2 in the morning when sleep was unavailable and clarity was the only thing going. She was not going to hide. She was done with hiding. She walked to the living room doorway and stood there. Han Seo-Yan was exactly as the photograph had suggested. Composed, controlled, dressed with the particular precision of someone who understood that appearance was a form of communication. She was also, Nia registered with some surprise, young. Younger than she'd seemed in print. 28, maybe 29. The composure had read as agelessness in photographs, but in person it read differently, as armor, as something constructed carefully around an interior that was not, perhaps, as settled as the surface suggested. Seo-Yan looked at Tae-Jun first. Then she looked at Nia in the doorway. Her gaze dropped to the visible pregnancy and came back up without expression. "You didn't take the offer," she said to Nia. "No. I assumed you wouldn't when the flight departed empty." She sat down on the couch without being invited, which Nia noted. "Then you both know what my father intends." "We know," Taejun said. He remained standing. "What I want to know is why you called her. The truth of it, Seo-yeon, not the version you constructed to make yourself useful." Seo-yeon was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands in her lap, a brief, unguarded look, the first thing Nia had seen from her that wasn't curated. Then she looked up. "My father doesn't intend to wait for the wedding to consolidate control," she said. "He intends to use the wedding as an event. Once the vows are complete and the alliance is formally recorded, he plans to move against your organization, Taejun, not as a partner, as an acquisition. He's been building the case for a federal indictment for 8 months, working with a prosecutor named Voss, Daniel Voss, in the Northern District. The indictment covers your entire leadership structure, your top 6 people, including Jin Ho. The wedding is the moment everything drops." The silence in the room had a specific quality, the silence of 2 people absorbing something that retroactively restructures everything they believed they understood. Taejun didn't move. "You're telling me your father has been coordinating with a federal prosecutor to destroy my organization, and to destroy mine afterward, yes." Seo-yeon met his eyes. "He doesn't want an alliance. He wants total control of everything both families hold, and he intends to use the federal government as the instrument to remove anyone who might challenge him, including me. I have no more future in his plan than you do." "And the woman you called, the threat against her, real?" He ordered it independently of the larger plan. "She's a visible complication, a pregnancy that produces a legitimate heir, potential sympathy from commission members who value bloodlines, a human vulnerability he can use against you, or eliminate to remove that vulnerability. He sees her as a loose thread. He intends to cut it." Nia stood in the doorway and listened to herself being discussed as a tactical problem, as a loose thread, as a complication to be eliminated, and felt something shift in her that had nothing to do with fear. Fear had been the governing emotion for 5 months, low-grade, managed, the constant background frequency of someone living carefully inside a dangerous situation. What replaced it now was something colder and more focused. Something that felt uncomfortably, like the emotion Taejun operated from. "You have evidence," she said. Seo-yeon looked at her. "Of the prosecutor, of the plan. You wouldn't come here with this unless you could back it up." Nia walked into the room fully, sat in the chair across from the couch, made herself part of the conversation rather than its backdrop. "What do you have and what do you want for it?" Something moved across Seo-yeon's face. Reassessment. She looked at Nia the way people sometimes looked at paintings when they realized the surface was more complex than the first glance suggested. "I have recordings," she said. 43 hours of conversation between my father and Voss going back 6 months. I have financial records showing payment transfers from my father's personal accounts to Voss through 3 shell companies. I have a timeline, a target list, and the indictment language my father paid Voss to deliver." She paused. "What I want is immunity and a transfer of my family's assets to my personal control, independent of my father. I want out of his organization, and I want the resources to stay out permanently." "You want me to help you take down your own father?" Taejun said. "I want us to take down a man who intends to destroy both of us and call it a wedding gift." She said it without inflection. "I don't have sentimental attachments to my father. I have practical ones, and he's about to make even those untenable." Taejun looked at Nia. Nia looked back at him. She was 33 weeks pregnant in a Chicago penthouse surrounded by a situation that had accelerated past every boundary she'd tried to maintain, with a Mafia heiress on the couch offering to burn her own family to the ground, and a man across the room whose eyes were asking her something he didn't have the language to ask out loud. He was asking if she trusted the intelligence. He was asking if she could read Seo-yeon the way she read surfaces, the way she read paintings, looking past the presented face to the damaged or complicated or genuine thing underneath. She looked at Han So-yeon, at the armor and the youth beneath it, and the specific quality of the rage she was keeping so rigorously controlled that it had smoothed her voice to a near monotone. At a woman who had come here alone, without her father's knowledge, to hand over 43 hours of recordings. This was not a performance. This was someone doing the only thing left available to them. She's telling the truth, Nia said. Taejun was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he looked at Seoyeon and said, "Show me the recordings." Seoyeon reached into her coat and produced a drive. And somewhere in the northern district of Illinois, a federal prosecutor named Daniel Voss was having what he believed was a very good week, completely unaware that the 3 people most motivated to destroy him had just agreed, in a penthouse above a city that looked like a bruise, to do exactly that, and that the woman who had identified the truth of Seoyeon's offer was not the mafia boss, not the heiress, but the art conservator who had learned, over a long career of saving beautiful things, that the most dangerous damage was always the kind that hid beneath a perfect. The recordings ran for 43 hours, and Taejun listened to all of them, not consecutively. That would have taken 2 days, and they didn't have 2 days. Jinho's team pulled the audio through analysis software overnight, flagging the highest density sections. The conversations where Voss and Han Myung-soo spoke with enough specificity to be actionable. By 4 in the morning, they had a working document. Names, dates, transfer amounts, the precise language of the indictment Voss had agreed to deliver, the timeline that ended on the wedding day. Nia sat in on the review session. She hadn't been invited. She had walked into the study at midnight with a glass of water and positioned herself in the chair by the window, and nobody asked her to leave, which she took as the agreement they hadn't formally made. Taejun glanced at her once when she came in, said nothing, returned to the monitor. She watched him work through the night and understood, in a way she hadn't fully before, what he actually was. Not the abstracted idea of it, not the newspaper profile or the careful public construction or even the version she'd been adjacent to for 4 months, which was the private human version but still filtered through the context of his space, his penthouse, his world. This was him operational. This was the specific quality of attention he deployed when something mattered enough to require his full capability, and it was, she thought with an uncomfortable honesty, extraordinary to watch. He didn't waste motion. He didn't perform urgency. He moved through information the way she moved through a damaged painting, methodically, without sentiment, locating the exact places where the structure had been compromised. At 3:47, he looked up from the monitor and said, to no one specifically, "The wedding." Jinho looked at him. "We use the wedding," Taejun said. "Every significant figure in both organizations will be in one room. Commission members, family heads, Myung-soo's entire inner circle. We don't move against him quietly. We move against him publicly, in front of everyone who matters, so there's no version of events he can construct afterward. We collapse the entire conspiracy in the room where he expected to complete it." Jinho was quiet for a moment. "The technical requirements for that, I know what they are. Can it be done in 9 days? 8 now." Jinho looked at the ceiling briefly. "Possibly. If we bring in Park and the Lim brothers for the technical setup. The ballroom at the Meridian has the infrastructure. It's the venue his people booked. The screens are already rigged for the reception presentation. We use his infrastructure." "Yes. Good." Taejun leaned back. "Nobody outside this room knows the plan. Not the scope of it. The people we bring in for technical work know their individual piece and nothing else." He looked at Nia then, full attention. "I need you somewhere safe for the 8 days before this happens," he said. "Not here. If Myung-soo's people know this address, I'm not going to another safe house where I sit and wait. Nia, I heard everything tonight." She set down the water glass. "I know what Voss looks like on paper. I know the shell company structures. I know the financial transfer patterns. I have spent my entire professional life identifying the difference between what something presents as and what it actually is. You're building a case to present to a room full of people who need to understand it instantly. I can help you build that presentation." Taejun looked at her for a long moment. "You want to help me take down the man who ordered your death," he said. "I want to take down the man who ordered my death," she said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled, just the edge of it, gone before it fully formed. He looked at Jinho. "She stays," he said. "Set her up with Park's team on the visual documentation." Jinho nodded without visible surprise, which told her that Jinho had been recalibrating his assessment of her for the last several hours and had arrived somewhere unexpected. She pulled her chair to the main table. They worked until dawn. Pause. The 8 days were the most concentrated and the most strange of Nia's life. Strange because of the juxtaposition. Because she was 34 weeks pregnant and building a criminal evidentiary presentation in a penthouse in Chicago, while outside the city continued its ordinary existence, and the cognitive dissonance of those two realities occupying the same body at the same time was something she had no framework for. Strange because she was good at it. Genuinely, usefully good. At organizing the financial documentation into visual sequences that told a story without requiring the audience to have a finance background. At identifying which recordings were most damning, not from a legal standpoint, but from a human one. At understanding instinctively what would land in a room full of powerful people who responded to emotional logic as much as factual logic. Taejun noticed. He didn't comment on it directly. He wasn't a man who narrated his observations. But she could see him adjusting his approach to her in small ways, bringing her into conversations she hadn't been in the room for previously, asking her read on things that were formally outside her expertise. On the fourth night, she said, "You're treating me like a strategist." He was reviewing transfer documents at the table. He looked up. "You are one. I'm an art conservator who is also approximately the size of a small vehicle. You identified Seo-yeon's truthfulness in 40 seconds when I needed 3 minutes and Jin-ho needed longer than that." He looked back at the documents. "That's not art conservation. That's the same skill applied differently." She didn't have a response to that. She filed it somewhere in the growing collection of things about this situation that she hadn't anticipated and wasn't ready to process. Seo-yeon remained in contact through a secure channel. She confirmed her father's plans were proceeding on schedule, confirmed the wedding venue and timeline, passed along the names of the security personnel Myung-soo intended to position inside the Meridian Ballroom. She was calm and systematic and asked nothing about Nia's well-being, which Nia found oddly easier to deal with than false warmth would have been. On day 6, Nia woke at 3 in the morning with contractions. Not labor. She knew the difference intellectually, had read everything available on the distinction between Braxton Hicks and active labor, but the knowing didn't entirely stop the cold spike of adrenaline that put her sitting upright in the east bedroom with her hand pressed flat against her stomach, timing the intervals by the clock on her phone. 8 minutes, then 11, then 15. Irregular. She breathed through 4 of them before they spaced out and faded, and she was able to lay back down. She did not tell Taejun. She told herself it was because there was nothing actionable to tell. They had passed. She was fine. The baby's movement remained normal. She knew, if she was being precise, that she also didn't want him to see her afraid. Not now. Not when she'd spent 6 days establishing herself as someone useful and capable in a situation that had every structural reason to reduce her to a protected object, rather than a participating person. She lay in the dark and pressed her palm flat and thought, 8 more days. Stay in there 8 more days, and then we're through the worst of it. The baby pushed back against her hand, steadily, firmly, as if confirming something. The morning of the wedding was cold and white. Chicago in December had a specific quality of cold, not just temperature but texture, something that got into the seams of things and made the city feel stripped back to its architecture, all steel and glass and the hard geometry of survival. Nia stood at the penthouse window at 6 in the morning and watched the light come up over the lake, flat and silver, and felt the particular quality of a day that everyone in it understood was not an ordinary one. Jinho's team had been in position since midnight. Park and the technical crew had accessed the Meridian systems through a vendor contact and had the ballroom screens integrated with their own output. Everything was in place. The plan was precise and had been rehearsed through enough scenarios that Taejun was satisfied with its resilience. Taejun came and stood beside her at the window. He was already dressed, dark suit, the particular quality of formal that was also armor, the clothes of a man prepared to walk into a room and do something from which there was no returning. "How are you?" he said. "I've been better." She said it honestly. "I've also been worse." "After today, don't." She turned to look at him. "Don't tell me what happens after today. Tell me what happens today, and we'll get to after when we're in it." He nodded. "If something goes wrong," she said, "if Myung-soo's people move before you get the presentation running, if anything deviates from the plan. Jin-ho takes you out the service exit. There's a car. I know about the car. I mean, if something goes wrong with you." He looked at her. "I need to know," she said. Not because I'm asking you to promise me something, because I need the complete information set to function. He was quiet for a moment. If something goes wrong with me, Jinho's standing orders are to get you out of Chicago tonight. There are accounts in your name, already set up, already funded. Jinho has the access information. You and the child are provided for regardless of what happens to me. When did you set that up? 3 days ago. 3 days ago. While she was working on visual documentation, while she was sleeping in the east bedroom, while she was eating crackers at the kitchen counter at 2 in the morning because sleep was intermittent and her stomach required constant management, he had quietly arranged her financial independence from whatever outcome today produced. She turned back to the window. Okay, she said. Okay. Go do what you need to do. The Meridian Ballroom was extraordinary and terrible in equal measure. Every significant figure in Chicago's criminal architecture had come to witness the historic alignment of 2 Korean dynasties, and they had dressed for the occasion with the particular formality of people who understood that certain events required a visible acknowledgement of their importance. Round tables set for 300. Flowers that had cost more than most people's monthly income. An orchestra running through preliminary pieces in the corner, filling the vaulted space with something that sounded like celebration, and was actually more like the score of a very expensive trap. Taejun moved through the room with Jinho at his shoulder, greeting the commission members, the family heads, the assorted power that had assembled itself in black tie to watch what it believed was a wedding. He was precise and unhurried and gave nothing away, which was the only performance required of him, to appear to be exactly what everyone in this room expected, right up until the moment he wasn't. Seo-yeon was already in the bridal preparation room with her attendants. She had confirmed via the secure channel at 8 this morning that her father's security arrangements were as mapped, that no deviations had been introduced. She was calm. Whatever she was feeling about the next hour of her life, she had put it somewhere it wouldn't interfere with function. Han Myung-soo stood near the front of the room with his inner circle, looking like a man who had already won something and was simply waiting for the formal acknowledgement of it. He was 64, broad-shouldered, with the particular authority of someone who had been the most dangerous person in every room he'd entered for 30 years. He looked at Taejun when Taejun approached and smiled the smile of a man receiving a tribute. Taejun, he clasped his hand. Today is a good day. It is, Taejun said. My daughter will make you a strong partner. I believe that. Myung-soo's eyes moved briefly, just a flicker, to something behind Taejun's shoulder, and Taejun catalogued it without reacting. A signal to someone, a small confirmation of position. Myung-soo was running his own timeline inside this room and had just checked in with it. Taejun squeezed his hand, released it, moved on. He found Jinho by the east wall. The check-in just happened, he said quietly. I saw it. The man by the service door. Myung-soo has 4 additional personnel we didn't account for. They came in with the catering vendor badges. 4 additional. Positions? 2 near the main exit, 1 by the service corridor, 1 near the soundboard. The soundboard. He's planning to cut the feed. If we run something he doesn't control, yes. He has someone in position to kill the power to the screens. Taejun processed this in approximately 4 seconds. Park needs to know. The backup system needs to be active before we start. Not as a failover, as the primary. If the main board goes down, the backup runs independently. Park's already here. I'll get to him now. Jinho moved. Taejun turned back to the room and looked at everything in it with the precise attention of someone who had spent his entire life inside environments where reading the room wrong was fatal. And he looked at Han Myung-soo across the space and understood with complete clarity that the man intended to let the ceremony complete before he moved, because the ceremony was the legal and social validation he needed, and that meant Taejun had a window, a specific, limited window, between the moment the music stopped and the moment the vows began. He needed to move before the ceremony started. The timeline compressed by 20 minutes. He pulled his phone. 1 message to Park, now. The orchestra stopped mid-phrase. It was the first thing the assembled guests registered. Not an ending, but a cut. The music simply ceasing where it had no reason to cease. And the quality of attention in the room shifted immediately. 300 people turning toward the front with the collective instinct of people who understood, at some animal level, that something had changed. The screens on the ballroom's three walls, enormous, installed for what the program described as a reception presentation, a photographic celebration of both families, came alive simultaneously. Not photographs, audio waveforms, financial documents, and then a voice, clear and close as if the speaker were standing in the room, Han Myung-soo's voice, specific and unmistakable, saying, "When the indictment drops, we'll need Voss to move within 48 hours. The Kang organization leadership will be in federal custody before the honeymoon ends. All assets transfer under the emergency compact. My daughter holds the paper, but I control the account." The room was absolutely silent. Tae-jun walked to the center of the space. He didn't need a microphone. The room's architecture carried his voice to every corner when he spoke at volume, and 300 people were giving him the kind of attention that required no amplification. "What you're watching," he said, "is 43 hours of recorded conversation between Han Myung-soo and federal prosecutor Daniel Voss of the Northern District. The financial documentation you're seeing confirms payment of $700,000 across 3 shell companies. The indictment they planned covers every leadership figure in this room, not just mine. Every family, every commission member, every alliance represented here tonight was a target." Han Myung-soo had gone the color of old concrete. "This is a lie." His voice came out with force, but Tae-jun could hear the fracture in it. "This is fabricated. Exhibit 4, Tae-jun said simply. The screen changed. Myung-soo's own voice again, clearer this time, a different conversation. "The commission won't question it if it comes from federal authority. They'll scatter. And a scattered organization is an organization without leverage. We absorb what's left." The room's silence had a new quality now. Not shock. Something colder. The particular silence of 300 powerful and dangerous people recalibrating who the enemy in this room actually was. Myung-soo moved. He made a gesture, sharp, downward, the signal to the man by the soundboard. And the main screens went dark exactly as Jin-ho had predicted. But Park's backup system held, running off an independent power source hardwired to the Meridian's emergency grid, and the screens came back in 4 seconds. 4 seconds of darkness, and then everything returning. And those 4 seconds were enough for every person in the room to understand that someone had just tried to stop what they were seeing. That attempt was, Tae-jun thought, the most damaging thing Myung-soo had done all morning. 3 of Myung-soo's inner circle moved for exits. Commission security moved faster. The man by the service door was on the floor in 6 seconds, controlled by 2 of Jin-ho's people who had been positioned there since before the guests arrived. Myung-soo turned to his right, to the man who had been standing at his shoulder all morning, his head of personal security, and found that man looking back at him with the specific expression of someone who has already done the math on which side of a situation they need to be on. "Don't," Myung-soo said to him. The man stepped back. 1 step, away from Myung-soo. Tae-jun watched Han Myung-soo understand, in real time, what it felt like when the architecture of loyalty you'd built your entire life on assessed the situation and chose differently. He watched the man's face move through something that started as rage and arrived at something more fundamental. The specific devastation of a person realizing that the power they believed they held was revealed, in the moment it mattered most, to have been conditional all along. "The commission will review the complete documentation tonight," Tae-jun said, to the room, to Myung-soo, to the 300 people who were already reaching their own conclusions. Han Myung-soo's organizational authority is suspended pending that review. His family's assets are frozen under the emergency compact that he himself wrote into the alliance agreement. A brief pause. He was very thorough. I appreciated that. Myung-soo lunged, not at Tae-jun, at his daughter. Seo-yeon had appeared in the ballroom entrance in her wedding dress at some point during the presentation. Tae-jun hadn't seen her arrive, didn't know how long she'd been standing there. And when her father turned on her with the specific fury of a man who had just identified the source of his destruction, she didn't move. She stood in the doorway in white and watched him come toward her with an expression that was not fear and was not triumph, but was something in between, that Tae-jun recognized as the face of someone who has paid a very high price for something and has decided the price was correct. He crossed the room in 4 strides, put himself between Myung-soo and his daughter. Myung-soo stopped. They were 12 inches apart. Tae-jun could see every line in the older man's face, every calculation running behind his eyes, the furious assessment of a cornered man working out whether there was still a move available. "It's over," Taejun said. Myung-soo breathed hard through his nose. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the specific physical response of a man whose entire body had flooded with adrenaline and had nowhere to direct it. "You have nothing," Myung-soo said. "The commission won't—" "The commission is already on the phone with Voss's supervisors," Taejun said. "The recordings are time-stamped and authenticated. The transfer records are public documentation. You built something careful and thorough, and you taught your daughter to do the same thing, and she was more thorough than you." He held the man's gaze. "Commission security is going to escort you out of this building now. What happens after that is not my decision." Myung-soo looked at Seo-yeon over Taejun's shoulder. She looked back at her father. She said nothing. She simply stood in her wedding dress in the doorway of a ballroom full of people who had just watched her burn her own family to the ground. And she held his gaze without flinching, and whatever passed between them in that look was something that belonged only to them and that Taejun deliberately did not try to read. Two commissioned security men took Myung-soo by the arms. He didn't fight it. He was too precise a man to fight something he'd already lost. He let himself be walked toward the exit with the particular rigidity of someone conserving whatever dignity remained. And as he passed through the ballroom doors and out into the corridor, the sound of 300 people beginning to talk again rose behind him like a tide coming in. Taejun stood in the center of the ballroom and felt the specific physical aftermath of sustained adrenaline. The slight shake in his hands, the elevated heart rate beginning its slow return, the exhaustion that was waiting behind the clarity of action for the moment he let it through. Jinho appeared at his shoulder. "Voss has been contacted by 3 separate commission lawyers in the last 10 minutes. He's talking." "Good. The 4 additional security personnel are contained. No injuries in the room." "Good." "Sir?" Jinho's voice changed slightly. "Ms. Okafor." Taejun turned. His phone was already in his hand. He'd sent the all-clear signal to the car 30 seconds after the screens came back up. "She should be—" Jinho's phone rang. He answered it, listened for 3 seconds, and looked at Taejun with an expression Taejun had never seen on him before. "She's in labor," Jinho said. "The car is 6 minutes from Northwestern. She's been having contractions since 4 this morning, and she didn't tell. She had been having contractions since 4 in the morning, and she hadn't told anyone." That was the detail that stayed with Taejun as Jinho drove. Not the labor itself, not the timing, not the fact that she'd spent 12 hours managing active contractions while helping coordinate the operational takedown of the man who'd ordered her death, but the specific choice to keep it to herself, to absorb it, to function through it because the work needed doing, and she had decided she was going to do it. He sat in the back seat with his dress jacket still on, and his hands very still in his lap, and thought about a woman he had spent 5 months searching for, and 8 days working beside, and a year failing to fully see. And he thought about what it cost her to make choices like that. The specific internal price of being someone who carried things alone because she'd learned, somewhere early and deep, that depending on other people for the basic business of survival was a liability she couldn't afford. He had taught her that lesson more thoroughly than anyone else. The car pulled up to Northwestern's emergency entrance at 7:41. Jinho had called ahead, and there was a nurse with a wheelchair at the door, and the wheelchair was empty because Nia was standing beside it, not sitting in it, one hand braced on the door frame of the car and the other pressed flat against her stomach. She was still in the clothes she'd been wearing in the penthouse, dark sweater, loose pants, the practical and unbeautiful uniform of someone who had not been planning to go into labor today specifically, had been planning it abstractly at some future point when the other things were resolved. She looked at Taejun when he came through the sliding doors. She didn't say anything. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who is managing a significant amount of pain and is very tired and is also, underneath those 2 things, furious at herself for the specific timing of her body's decisions. "I know," she said, before he could speak. "You've been in labor since 4. "I know." "You didn't say anything." "I know, Taejun." A contraction moved through her and he watched her absorb it. The jaw tighten, the breath change, the controlled exhale through her nose. And when it passed, she looked at him directly. "I didn't think it would move this fast. I thought I had time." "You always think you have more time than you do." "That's very insightful. Can we have this conversation after?" The nurse stepped forward. Taejun took Nia's arm. Not aggressively, not possessively, just offered his forearm and let her decide whether to take it. And she took it, and they walked into Northwestern Memorial together. Labor is not cinematic. Nia had known this intellectually and found that the intellectual knowledge did not adequately prepare her for the physical reality, which was relentless and biological and stripped away every layer of composed selfhood she'd constructed over the last 8 months, until there was nothing left but the work her body was doing and the specific quality of pain that has no analogy in ordinary experience. She'd had a birth plan. She'd made it 6 weeks ago in a notebook in Marlene's bakery, sitting at the table after closing with a cup of ginger tea, writing out what she wanted in neat, practical sentences because making plans was how she coped with things she couldn't control. The plan lasted approximately 40 minutes. Taejun stayed. She hadn't asked him to and she hadn't told him to leave. And so he stayed, positioned at the edge of her field of vision, not hovering, not performing concern, but present the way she'd learned he could be present when he chose to be, in the specific way of someone who understood that the most useful thing he could do was be available without demanding acknowledgement of his availability. At one point, she lost track of exactly when, time had become elastic and unreliable. She grabbed his hand because she needed something to hold on to that wasn't a bed rail, and she held it with more force than she'd intended, and he didn't react. He just let her hold it. He looked at her face instead of at anything else happening in the room, and she found that specific choice, to look at her face, to give her his attention rather than the medical situation, steadied her in a way she hadn't expected and didn't have language for. At 3:47 in the afternoon, their daughter was born. She was furious about it. She arrived with a protest, a sound that filled the delivery room immediately, strong and clear and unambiguous about her position on the disruption she'd been subjected to. And the nurse laughed, and the doctor said something routine and reassuring, and Nia lay back against the raised bed and breathed in shallow, ragged increments and felt the specific extremity of that moment, the absolute animal reality of what her body had just accomplished, and the specific surreal quality of hearing her daughter's voice for the first time. They put her on Nia's chest. The baby stopped crying almost immediately, turned her head against Nia's skin with the blind, instinctive certainty of something that knows exactly where it needs to be. Small and complete and temporary looking, the way all newborns looked, with her dark hair and her tight-closed fists, and the specific quality of new existence that had no precedent and no analog. Nia pressed her cheek to the top of the baby's head and closed her eyes. She heard Taejun make a sound. Very quiet. Not a word. Just a sound. The kind that escapes before a man decides whether to let it out. And she didn't look at him because she didn't need to. She just kept her eyes closed and held her daughter and breathed. After a moment, she said, "Come here." He came. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she adjusted so he could see the baby properly. And he looked at his daughter for the first time with an expression that was not the controlled devastation she'd seen in the bakery doorway, and not the operational precision she'd watched him deploy for 8 days. It was something more foundational than either of those things. Something that looked like a man being introduced to a fact he hadn't been capable of fully imagining until it was in front of him. He reached out. His hand was large against the baby's back. She was so small. "She's real," he said. It was a ridiculous thing to say. He seemed to know it was a ridiculous thing to say and said it anyway, which she found, in her exhausted and raw and slightly irrational state, more moving than anything carefully constructed would have been. "She's real," Nia confirmed. They stayed like that for a while. The room settled around them into the particular quiet of a space where something irreversible has just occurred, and everyone in it is adjusting to the new reality. 3 weeks later, Daniel Voss entered a plea agreement with the Department of Justice. Nia read about it on her phone in the nursery at 2 in the morning while the baby ate, because the baby ate at 2 in the morning with the relentless consistency of someone who had decided that nighttime schedules were a convention that did not apply to her. The plea covered conspiracy charges, abuse of prosecutorial authority, and 3 counts of wire fraud. Voss named 5 additional individuals in his cooperation agreement, all of them connected to Han Myung-soo's financial network. Han Myung-soo himself was in commission custody. The formal process that governed these things, the specific, elaborate, extra-legal machinery by which the organized structures Taejun operated within resolved catastrophic breaches of compact, was moving at its own pace, which was not the pace of the federal justice system. and was not subject to its evidentiary standards. Taejun had told her it would take months. He had told her she didn't need to know the specific outcome. She had told him that she did need to know, because she had been involved in the evidence that produced it, because her life and her daughter's life had been the stakes. He had told her the truth of it, which was that Myung-soo would not be in a position to threaten anyone again. He had said it with the flat certainty she'd learned to read accurately, and she had accepted it and not pushed further, because there was a line between the information she needed and the information she needed not to carry, and she was learning where that line was. Han Seo-yeon had left the country 9 days after the wedding that wasn't. She'd gone to Switzerland as she'd originally offered Nia, and had taken with her the assets she'd negotiated for her cooperation, and had sent a single message through the secure channel before she went. The child is lucky to have a mother with her instincts. Take care of her. Nia had read it twice and then set her phone down and fed the baby and didn't respond, because there was nothing to say to Seo-yeon that would cover what had passed between them, the strange and transactional and ultimately real thing they'd done together in opposing directions, both of them burning something down to protect something else. The engagement had been formally dissolved in a 2-sentence statement released 3 days after the commission meeting. Nobody in the relevant world required more explanation than that. The circumstances were sufficiently known to make elaboration redundant. Taejun came to the east bedroom, her room, the one that had been hers since she came back, on a Thursday evening in January, when the baby was 3 weeks old and Chicago was locked in the specific miserable beauty of deep winter, and Nia was sitting in the chair by the window, not sleeping because sleep had become something that happened in 40-minute increments, and she'd stopped grieving its absence and started treating it as the new architecture of her life. He knocked. He always knocked. "Come in," she said. He came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her in the chair with the baby against her chest. And he had that expression again, the one she'd stopped trying to classify and had started just allowing to exist without putting language to it. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Okay. I've been thinking about what you said. In the diner." He looked at his hands briefly. "That you didn't want protection. That you wanted to not be in a situation that required it." "I remember. I can't give you that." He said it without hedging. "The world I operate in, the reality of it, not a softened version, it requires protection. It requires security and vigilance, and a level of management of risk that I can't simply turn off because it would be more comfortable. That is not going to change. I want to be honest with you about that." She looked at him. "I know, but the terms of it can change." He looked up. "You said you wouldn't come back as what you were before. That you weren't a guest in my space. That if you were in it, you were in it fully. With information, with a voice and decisions that affected you, as a person who participated rather than was managed." He paused. "I want to build something that reflects that, not as a promise I'm making because the situation requires it, as the actual structure of what this is going forward." "What does that mean specifically?" "It means the east bedroom becomes yours permanently, or a different space does, or we redesign the entire floor. Whatever you need to feel like it's your home and not my home that you're permitted to be in. It means you have access to every piece of information that affects your safety and the baby's safety. It means when I make decisions that involve either of you, you're part of making them." He stopped. "Rebuilt. It means I am done operating as though wanting you here is the same as choosing you." The window behind her was dark with winter, and the city below was lit and cold, and the baby had fallen asleep against her chest with the absolute completeness of a newborn who has processed all available input and found it satisfactory. "That's a different thing than love," Nia said. "Not an accusation, just accurate." "Yes," he said. "It is. The structure of what I just described is different from love, but it's also—" He stopped again, and she could see him doing the thing she'd watched him do across 8 days of working together, the thing she'd come to recognize as his specific form of struggle, the effort of a man trained to precision, trying to find the right language for something that resisted precision. It's built from what love looks like when you strip away the performance of it, when it's not about the feeling but about the daily set of choices you make that say, this person is worth the cost of being honest with, and the cost of being wrong about, and the cost of rebuilding things correctly when you've built them wrong. She was quiet for a moment. The baby shifted slightly against her chest, settled again. You said the old empire was built on political marriages and fear, she said. At the wedding. It was. What's the new one built on? He looked at her directly. I don't know yet. I know what I want it to not be built on. I know what I want it to be built toward. He held her gaze. I want you to help me figure out the rest. Nia looked at Kong Tai-jun in the low light of her room in his penthouse, which she was going to stop thinking of as his penthouse and start thinking of differently because the words she used for things mattered to her, and she was precise about them. She looked at a man who had failed her in a specific and costly way, and had spent 8 months understanding exactly how and why, without excusing it. She looked at a man whose daughter was asleep on her chest right now with her tiny fist curled against Nia's collarbone. She had spent 5 months building a life from scratch to prove to herself that she could. She had done it. She knew she could. She didn't need to keep proving it. I'm going back to conservation work, she said. When she's old enough, I need that. I need something that's mine and that has nothing to do with this world. Yes. And I'm keeping the bakery contact, Marlene. I want to be able to call her. Of course. And if I ever decide this isn't working, if the cost of being inside this world becomes a cost I'm not willing to pay. You don't fight it. You don't search for me. You don't deploy resources. We work out something that puts her first and you let me go. He was quiet for a moment. She could see what that cost him. The specific effort of a man who did not accept losses, making a preemptive agreement to accept a particular one if it came to that. Yes, he said. Okay. She looked down at the baby, looked back up. Then come sit here. She's going to wake up in about 20 minutes, and she's going to want to look at something interesting, and she seems to have decided your face qualifies. He almost smiled. More of it this time than before. Not quite complete, but closer. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside hers, close enough that his shoulder was adjacent to hers, and the baby slept between them in the low light. And outside the window, Chicago lay cold and lit and complicated under its winter sky. In the spring, Nia went back to work. 3 days a week, at a restoration studio in River North that had reached out to her 6 weeks after her name quietly re-entered circulation. A colleague who knew her real work, who had heard she was back in Chicago, who had a backlog of damaged pieces and a specific need for someone who could look at a painting and understand what it had been before the damage found it. She took the job. She left the baby with a woman named Rosa, who had been recommended through a channel she'd vetted herself, background checked, referenced, approved. And she took the train to River North 3 mornings a week and walked into a studio that smelled like solvent and old canvas and the specific quality of quiet that attended fragile things. And she sat down at a work table and picked up her tools and felt something return to her that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying the absence of. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. On her 3rd week back, she was working on a 19th century oil that had been damaged in a storage flood. The surface cracked and darkened, the original image almost completely obscured, and she was in the careful early stage of reading it, of trying to understand what was underneath the damage, when she became aware that she was thinking about Tae-jun. Not anxiously. Not with the complicated tangle of need and wariness that had characterized most of her thoughts about him over the last year. Just thinking about him, the way you think about someone who is part of the ordinary fabric of a day, the way you think about something that is yours. She picked up a fine brush and began the careful work of clearing a small section of damaged surface, working from the edge inward, the way you always started, slowly, with full attention, without assumptions about what you'd find underneath. The color that emerged was a deep, specific blue. Unexpected. Nothing in the visible damage had suggested it. She leaned in closer. There were things you couldn't know about a painting until you started the work. Things the surface hid, not out of deception, but simply because the damage had accumulated in layers and the layers had their own logic. You couldn't be angry at the layers, you just had to work through them, carefully, until you found what had been there before the harm. She worked for an hour without looking up. That evening, she went home. The penthouse had changed in the months since she'd come back. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures, but in the small accumulated ways that spaces change when they are genuinely inhabited by more than one person's life. A corner of the living room held the organized chaos of baby equipment. Her books were on the shelves beside his. A mobile she'd made from old conservation materials, scraps of archival paper, bits of Japanese tissue, tiny shapes cut from the remnants of a project, hung in the nursery doorway and turned slowly in the draft from the hall. Taejun was in the kitchen when she came in. He was on the phone, the low, hard cadence that meant something operational, and he looked up when he heard her and held up one finger. A minute, and she nodded and set her bag down and went to the nursery. The baby was awake in her crib, looking up at the mobile with the particular focused intensity she'd developed in the last few weeks. The intensity of a person who has recently discovered that the world contains things worth examining closely. She had Taejun's eyes and Nia's mouth and an expression that belonged entirely to herself, alert, serious, on the verge of something. Nia leaned over the crib rail. "Hi," she said. The baby turned her head at the sound of her voice, looked at her, and then, 3 months old, at the outer edge of when this was supposed to happen, she smiled. Not the reflexive, unfocused expression of the first weeks, but a real smile, directed and specific, aimed at Nia's face with the complete certainty of someone who knows exactly who is in front of them and has decided this is a person worth smiling at. Nia felt the specific impact of it in her chest, the place where she kept the things that mattered most and protected most carefully. She reached in and picked the baby up and held her against her shoulder, and the baby grabbed a fistful of her hair with the grip strength that continued to be astonishing. And Nia stood in the nursery in the penthouse above Chicago and felt the specific, unsentimentalized truth of where she had arrived. Not at a fairy tale, not at an absence of complication, not at a life that had resolved itself into simplicity, but at something real, something built from what actually happened rather than what she'd imagined, and chosen forward from rather than run from. She heard Taejun's call end, heard him in the hallway. He appeared in the nursery doorway and looked at her holding the baby, and something moved across his face that was not the controlled devastation of the bakery doorway, and not the operational precision of the 8 days before the wedding, and not even the careful, costly honesty of the January evening in her room. It was simpler than all of those things. It was just a man looking at his family. "How is the studio?" he said. "Good." She turned so he could see the baby's face. She smiled at me. A real one. He crossed the room, stood beside her, looked at his daughter, who had transferred her focused attention to him now, and was examining his face with the same serious intensity she'd applied to the mobile. "She does that to me too," he said. "In the mornings, when I come in before you're up." Nia looked at him. "You come in here in the mornings?" "She's usually awake. She seems to find the city interesting." He nodded toward the window where the winter light had softened toward evening. "I show her the buildings." Nia looked at the window, looked at Taejun, looked at her daughter, who was looking at her father with the complete and uncomplicated openness of someone who had not yet learned to protect herself from caring about people, and would, Nia thought, need to learn something of that eventually. But not now. Not yet. Now she got to just look at her father with that open face and not know yet what it cost. "What do you tell her?" Nia said. "About the buildings." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the baby. "That they're ours, the city. That it's complicated and it's ours anyway. And the complicated part is what makes it worth knowing." Nia breathed in slowly, breathed out. She pressed her cheek to the top of the baby's head the way she had in the delivery room, the same gesture, and felt the same thing she'd felt then. The absolute reality of it, the irreversibility, the specific gravity of something that had become the fixed point around which everything else now moved. Outside, Chicago went on being itself, layered and cold and lit and relentless, full of damage and beauty in the particular combination that characterized anything worth the work of understanding. Inside, the mobile turned slowly in the draft from the hall, and the baby, held between her parents in the last of the winter light, closed her fingers around nothing in particular and held on.